Anakin Skywalker's descent into committing acts that could be classified as genocide is a narrative deeply intertwined with his character arc in the Star Wars saga. To understand why he engaged in such heinous acts, one must delve into the psychological, ideological, and situational forces that shaped his path. These actions were not born out of a simple desire for destruction, but rather from a complex mix of fear, ambition, manipulation, and a perverse sense of justice. At the heart of Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader lies his intense emotional volatility and vulnerability. From the outset, Anakin was marked by his extraordinary power in the Force, which gave him great potential but also placed immense expectations upon him. Discovered as a young slave on Tatooine, Anakin carried with him a deep sense of loss and abandonment. The death of his mother, Shmi, at the hands of Tusken Raiders served as a key moment in solidifying his relationship with violence. Overwhelmed by grief and anger, Anakin massacred not just the warriors who had captured her, but their entire community. This act was fueled by personal anguish rather than ideology, but it set a precedent for his later actions. Anakin's actions against the Tuskens revealed the depth of his emotional dependency on those he cared about, as well as his inability to accept loss. His fear of loss only grew more intense as his attachment to Padme Amidala deepened. Forbidden by the Jedi Code, their secret marriage was both a source of joy and a growing crack in his allegiance to the Order. Anakin's love for Padme was possessive and obsessive, manifesting not in selflessness but in a desperate need to control her fate. This vulnerability was exploited by Emperor Palpatine, who planted the seeds of mistrust in the Jedi while positioning himself as a mentor to Anakin. Palpatine's influence was instrumental in shaping Anakin's turn toward the dark side. Under the guise of Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, Palpatine manipulated galactic conflicts and carefully preyed on Anakin's insecurities. Anakin's belief in the Jedi Order had already been shaken by their rigid doctrines and their often hypocritical adherence to non-attachment. Palpatine's promise to save Padme from death, an inevitability that Anakin foresaw in his prophetic visions, became the catalyst for his fall. His fear of losing her, combined with the perception that the Jedi were withholding the power that could save her, created a moral justification in his mind for turning against them. When Anakin pledged himself to Darth Sidious, Palpatine, and became Darth Vader, his first significant act was the slaughter of the Jedi at the Coruscant Temple, including the younglings. This was an act of calculated ruthlessness, designed to sever all ties to his former life and demonstrate his commitment to the Sith cause. In Anakin's warped perspective, this massacre was not simply an act of evil. It was a necessary step to achieve the power needed to save Padme. By committing such atrocities, Anakin justified his actions as serving a greater good, even as they plunged him deeper into darkness. The massacre at the Jedi Temple was followed by a series of campaigns that further entrenched Vader in the machinery of destruction. Under Palpatine's command, he played a leading role in the eradication of the separatist leaders on Mustafar, completing the purge of any opposition to the Galactic Empire. Anakin's role in these acts of systemic slaughter stemmed not just from obedience to his new master but also from a growing belief in the efficiency of authoritarianism. As Vader, he came to view the elimination of entire populations, whether Jedi or dissenting groups, as a necessary measure to establish order in the galaxy. Anakin's susceptibility to authoritarian ideology is a key element of his descent. Throughout his life, he exhibited a need for control, a trait exacerbated by his immense power in the Force. He often struggled with the Jedi Order's reluctance to use their power more assertively, criticizing their inaction in the face of conflict. Anakin's disdain for perceived weakness and chaos made him more receptive to the Sith philosophy, which emphasized strength and dominance. By the time he became Vader, he had fully embraced the belief that his actions, no matter how brutal, were justified if they served to bring about a stable and orderly galaxy. Another factor that drove Anakin to commit acts of genocide was the dehumanization of his victims. The Jedi, the Separatists, and later the Rebel Alliance were all painted as enemies of peace and stability. Through the lens of Sith ideology, these groups were not seen as individuals with lives and agency, but as obstacles to be removed. This perspective made it easier for Anakin to justify his actions. His early massacre of the Tusken Raiders foreshadowed this mindset. By viewing them as savages rather than people, he rationalized their extermination. This same logic was applied on a larger scale as Vader. Moreover, the gradual loss of Anakin's humanity played a significant role in his increasing comfort with acts of mass murder. As he embraced the dark side, his physical transformation mirrored his psychological descent. Encased in the armor of Darth Vader, he became more machine than man, a living weapon of the Emperor's will. This new identity allowed Anakin to distance himself from his former self and the guilt associated with his actions. The anonymity of his mask and the fear it inspired in others reinforced his sense of power and detachment. Anakin Skywalker's transformation into Darth Vader was not a single, abrupt moment but a gradual descent marked by repeated choices that eroded his moral compass. His journey into committing acts of genocide cannot be understood in isolation. It is the culmination of a life shaped by trauma, manipulation, and a growing acceptance of authoritarianism. As Darth Vader, Anakin's actions became increasingly divorced from the compassionate and idealistic young man he once was, revealing the extent to which his inner conflicts and external pressures shaped his choices. The emotional wounds Anakin carried from childhood created fertile ground for his eventual descent. As a slave on Tatooine, he experienced firsthand the cruelty of subjugation and the loss of agency. This instilled in him a lifelong fear of powerlessness, which later drove his obsessive need for control. These feelings were compounded by the early loss of his mother, which planted the seeds of his vengeful nature. His massacre of the Tusken Raider tribe, including women and children, was a pivotal moment in his moral decline. While this act was framed as an impulsive outburst of grief and anger, it also revealed Anakin's growing willingness to use violence as a means of exerting control over his pain. Anakin's relationship with Padme Amidala further complicated his trajectory. While their love was genuine, it was also fraught with secrecy and forbidden by the Jedi Code. For Anakin, Padme represented the stability and unconditional love he had lacked throughout his life. His fear of losing her became an obsession, exacerbated by his prophetic visions of her death. Anakin's inability to accept mortality, both his own and that of his loved ones, became a driving force in his descent. His eventual alliance with Palpatine was not initially motivated by a desire for power, but by the promise of saving Padme. Yet, this desperate bid to prevent loss led him to commit unspeakable acts, including the slaughter of the Jedi younglings in the Coruscant Temple. The Jedi Order's role in Anakin's fall cannot be ignored. While the Jedi sought to instill discipline and detachment, their rigid adherence to tradition often alienated Anakin. Their reluctance to fully embrace him as an equal, despite his extraordinary abilities, fostered feelings of resentment and mistrust. This dynamic was only worsened by the growing political corruption of the Republic, which the Jedi struggled to navigate. Anakin's sense of betrayal by the Jedi reached its peak when they asked him to spy on Chancellor Palpatine, a man he regarded as a mentor and friend. This perceived hypocrisy reinforced Anakin's belief that the Jedi were self-serving and unworthy of his loyalty. Palpatine's manipulation of Anakin was masterful, exploiting his insecurities and feeding his disillusionment with the Jedi. Palpatine positioned himself as the only figure who truly understood Anakin's potential and struggles. By framing the Sith philosophy as a path to greater power and enlightenment, he offered Anakin an alternative to the constraints of the Jedi Code. The promise of saving Padme, combined with the allure of unrestrained power, ultimately tipped the scales. When Anakin chose to align himself with Palpatine, he believed he was making a sacrifice for the greater good, protecting Padme and ensuring order in a chaotic galaxy. The aftermath of this choice was catastrophic. Anakin's first major act as Darth Vader, the massacre at the Jedi Temple, was a symbolic severing of his ties to his past. By murdering not only the Jedi Knights but also the younglings, Anakin crossed a moral threshold that left no room for redemption. This act was not only a demonstration of his loyalty to the Sith but also a statement of his newfound belief in the necessity of absolute authority. Anakin justified these actions as part of a broader vision for the galaxy, one in which peace could only be achieved through the eradication of dissent. As Darth Vader, Anakin became a key enforcer of the Empire's genocidal policies. His role in suppressing resistance and exterminating perceived threats to Imperial rule was driven by both his loyalty to Palpatine and his internalization of Sith ideology. The Sith philosophy, which prioritized power and domination, allowed Vader to rationalize acts of mass slaughter as necessary steps toward a stable galaxy. This rationale was evident in the destruction of Alderaan, an act of genocide carried out under the guise of demonstrating the Empire's strength. While the Death Star was commanded by Grand Moff Tarkin, Vader's complicity in these atrocities underscores his willingness to use fear and violence as tools of governance. A critical aspect of Vader's descent was his growing detachment from the humanity of his victims. Encased in his mechanical armor, he became a symbol of fear and destruction, severed from the emotional connections that once defined him. This detachment was both a coping mechanism and a reflection of his embrace of the dark side. By dehumanizing those he killed, Vader was able to suppress any lingering guilt or doubt. This psychological distance allowed him to commit acts of genocide with the cold efficiency expected of a Sith Lord. However, it is important to note that Anakin's descent into darkness was not entirely devoid of inner conflict. Throughout his time as Vader, glimpses of the man he once was occasionally surfaced, particularly in moments of reflection or confrontation with his past. This internal struggle would later become pivotal in his eventual redemption. Despite the enormity of his crimes, the remnants of Anakin's compassion and love for his family ultimately proved stronger than the hatred and fear that had consumed him. In the end, Anakin's journey is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, fear, and the seductive nature of authoritarianism. His willingness to commit genocide was not born out of an inherent love for destruction, but from a combination of personal trauma, ideological corruption, and the belief that his actions served a higher purpose. Anakin's story serves as a stark reminder of how even the most well-intentioned individuals can be led down a path of unimaginable darkness.